Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, depending on where in the world you are joining us from. My name is Hans Kundanani, and I am the head of the Europe programme at Chatham House, and I am absolutely delighted to be moderating this discussion to launch a new research paper by Philip Manow, The Political Economy of Populism in Europe, which we've just published and we're really excited about and looking forward to discussing over the next 90 minutes or so. In addition to Philip, who's going to present the paper, we are really excited that we have Danny Roderick, Professor of International Political Economy at Harvard, and Sherry Berman, Professor of Political Science at Barnard College in New York. I first came across Philip's work in 2018 when he published this brilliant little book, Die politische Ökonomie des Populismus, which I read at the time, and I thought it was so good because it seemed to me to go so far beyond the debate on populism at that time, which was very much within these, the debate was very much around the sort of cultural versus economic causes of populism. And what often seemed to happen, at least seemed to me to happen in that discussion, was that people often made generalizations about populism, and in particular about the causes of populism, based on individual cases, whether that was Britain in the context of Brexit or Trump or whatever. And actually, those theories didn't really capture the sort of heterogeneity of populism, particularly in Europe. Philip's argument, I thought, was the first that really sort of seriously engaged with that problem of the heterogeneity and how certain conditions produce certain kinds of populism and other conditions produce other kinds of populism, and seeing that the whole phenomenon in the context of hyperglobalization. I was expecting there to be an English translation of Philip's book, but English language publishers didn't, I think they missed the trick a little bit, but their loss is our gain, because it meant that we were able to publish the first sort of extended English language version of this argument towards the end of last year. The argument that Philip makes is very much influenced by Danny Roderick, and in particular this idea that the way you understand populism is as a function of these hyperglobalization shocks, which is part of why we're so excited to have Danny join us for this discussion and to respond to Philip's paper. We're also just generally big fans of Danny Roderick's work in the Europe programme at Chatham House. It's influenced how we think about European politics and about the EU. So this was a wonderful opportunity to have Danny join us. And we're also really happy to have Sherry, who I think is one of the most brilliant political scientists around, but in particular has also written extensively about Europe and gets European politics, I think, in a way that quite a lot of American political scientists, I think, don't, because they tend to see Europe, and particularly around these questions to do with democracy and populism, through the prism of American politics, rather than seeing that actually sometimes things work a little bit differently in Europe. So we're really looking forward to hearing Sherry's response as well. This session is on the record, so feel free to tweet about it. We'll post the video online afterwards. And the way we're going to do this is that Philip is going to spend about 20 minutes or so presenting the ideas in the paper, and then we'll have responses from Danny and then Sherry, and that will leave us hopefully plenty of time for questions and comments from the audience. And the way we're going to do that is if you write your questions in the Q&A box, I will keep an eye on that and then ask some of those questions to Philip, to Danny, to Sherry, whoever you want to ask a question to. Don't use the chat box for questions if there are technical issues and so on, or if you want to have a sort of side conversation, you can use the chat for that. But if you want to ask a question, do use the Q&A box, not the chat function. So with that, over to you, Philip. Tell us about the paper.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks to Hans and Pippin for organizing this event and for organizing the publication of that research paper in the Chatham House research paper series. I'm very much excited that Sherry and Dan agreed to comment on that paper. That's a big honor. And so, yeah, let's go, because time is scarce, and we want to have enough time for discussion and debate. So if everything works fine, you should be able to see my presentation now. If not, somebody has to give me a signal that things go wrong. Hans gave some background, so that spares me some half a minute or two explaining where this argument comes from. This is the paper itself, but I want to start a little bit with empirical context. The book has been published in German in 2018. It reflects the time a little bit. So that's already 3.5 years now over, and things are changing fast, as you know. But I still want to go a little bit back to that, to my starting observations and the motivations why I developed that argument in 2018. And then we still can think, and I think our discussion will also be a little bit about what has changed since then, and why the picture has changed, and how this can be accommodated by the conceptual framework which I propose here. So my first observation was really a striking north-south divide. As anybody familiar with the phenomenon of populism will know that this north-south divide in Europe isn't as marked anymore as it has been in the, let's say, in the last decade, between 2010 and 2020. We have the rise of right-wing populism now also in countries like Spain with Vox, or in Italy with Lega, but that was a long time not the case. And if one looked at the picture around 2016, 17, 19, it looked pretty much like that. So this is a very rough do-it-yourself way of trying to visualize that north-south divide, in the sense of simply taking party positions from the Chapel Hill expert survey, the data set, normalizing that to -5 and +5 from far left to far right, and then simply multiplying that with the vote share of those parties which usually we categorize as populist. And there again, I would not do my own operationalization, but rely on something like Rodin's and Mulder's populist data set. So that's was one of the starting observations. I thought a comparative theory of populism would be pushed to provide an explanation for that kind of picture we saw. So Syriza, Podemos, Cinque Stelle, La France Insoumise in the south, and then Sweden Democrats, FPÖ, UKIP, AfD, you name it, the further north you go. The second observation, coming from a German context, was that I could provide many pictures showing that not only for Germany, but this figure shows that it's not outsiders, it's not marginal labor market groups, it's not those in precarious employment which vote for the AfD in Germany, but it's rather insider. So it's rather the German Facharbeiter, so the core member of the old German model. So if we have on the x-axis something like insider-outsiderness going from left to right, outsider to insiderness, it's not at the margins of the labor market and which vote. So it's not those in marginal employment or in unemployment and so on and so on. And that's a very stable finding, however you operationalize. And it's also a finding which you would find, for instance, if you look at the voters for the Sweden Democrats. So the traditional modernization loser explanations or globalization loser explanations really did not so much explain patterns like those found to be found in Germany or Austria. So that was my starting observation. You could also provide a geographical map of Germany, and you would say the AfD is strong in the southern parts of Germany, and these are the highly globalized, highly competitive, highly productive, and highly prosperous regions of Baden-Württemberg, Bavaria, and Saxony, both in the east and in the west. The German discussion was very much obsessed with the East-West divide, of course, yes, and of course that's a strong divide, no doubt about that. But if you look within the East and within the West, It were the globalized, prosperous regions where there were the AfD strongholds, the right-wing populist strongholds. So these were my starting observations, and I thought a comparative explanation of populism in Europe and beyond must be able to say something to this kind of patterns. So that's my outline for now. I want to give a very brief critique of the literature. Then I will very briefly introduce my explanatory scheme, and then at the rest, in the end, I would give some empirical evidence for that, which is not in the paper. The paper is really conceptual, and it's there is no hardcore evidence, supporting my claims, and I will provide a little bit of that in the remaining minutes. So we have a literature which really says, okay, populism is not really about policy content. It's not really about left and right. It's really about, it's a style of politics. Jan Werner Müller himself said populism is not about policy content. And I think there is, of course, truth to that. So, so there is a supply side of populism, and there are things like, as we know, Twitter and the new social media, which make it more easier to pursue a populist style of politics. Absolutely. So Trump without Twitter is not thinkable. So there is absolutely truth to it, but still, I would say now there is also there are real grievances. With the Rust Belt in the US, with the deindustrialized North in Britain, and so on. So there is also a demand side, and we should look at that. And for instance, we should have an idea why we see left-wing populism in some places and right-wing populism in other places. We have, of course, a very cultural explanation, like the one by Ronald Inglehart and Pippa Norris. Saying really it's a kind of cultural backlash, but again that really doesn't speak to questions of left-wing populism. But I think this is a real phenomenon, not an irreal phenomenon, and it's also a longue durée explanation and is not really able to explain why countries where the silent revolution hasn't really much started, like in Poland or even Turkey or Russia, is where we see the same kind of populist phenomenon, like in countries in Sweden or the Netherlands, where the silent revolution, the post-materialism, has been underway since long time. So then there is this explanation saying, okay, it's really the losers of globalization, those affected, for instance, by the China shock. And that, of course, is a very rich and very solid and persuasive literature. Much of the case studies really come from, for instance, UKIP, Brexit, that complex, or from Trump, from the US. And of course, that's a very rich and very impressive literature. But as I said, it seemed to apply to some cases. And not to others. For instance, if you look to the south of Germany, these were not regions negatively affected by the China shock, but the German manufacturing produced exactly that kind of machine tool products which the Chinese needed then to produce the goods with which they deindustrialized the Rust Belt or the north of England. So. Again, it's clear why we see left-wing populism in certain places and right-wing populism in others. The same is true for the kind of the revenge of the places that don't matter explanation by Rodriguez Posé and others. So the strong stress of this urban-rural divide, which again seems to apply to countries like France, for instance, or Britain or the US, but not, for instance, to Germany or Switzerland or other cases. Then there is a relatively complicated literature which tries to combine the cultural and the economic explanation. It's linked to Hans-Peter Krisi and others. Yes, again, there is not really an explanation for left-wing populism, only for right-wing populism. It is haunted by the same selection bias problems that most of that literature has. So first we collect all the cases of either kind of populism, and then we explain it without asking questions like why no left-wing populism in that place, or why no right-wing populism. So we have this kind of selection problem in that literature methodologically, and this kind of literature shares that. Again, they don't have really an answer with respect to left-wing populism. And again, also, if we look closely, they rather tend to stress cultural factors, but not economic ones. So a really truly comparative political economy explanation was not provided much when I started to write on that. An important exception being Danny Roderick's article, which was a major source of inspiration to me. And it has not been very prominently published, so it might be that not everybody saw it already. But it is a strong element of my explanation, especially since it says, okay, we have two kinds of globalization shocks, which we should distinguish. One is related to the cross-border movement of capital and goods, and whenever globalization manifests itself in shocks of that kind, we should expect something like left-wing populism to arise. And then we have also the movement of people across borders, aka migration, and whenever a globalization shock manifests itself in that form, we should see right-wing populism. That has something to do with ideological orientations of these parties. Left parties have a hard time developing an anti-migration stance, but it's much more easier for them to articulate grievances about global capital or open trade, so to speak, about capitalism. So in my argument really builds very strongly on that basic proposition by Danny, but then it tries, whereas the original paper really tried to explain Latin American left-wing populism versus European right-wing populism, I think really that the European landscape is a little bit more complicated, and that we do have this kind of geographical divide between North and South and West and East, and that in fact, if we look more closely to welfare states and labor markets, we get a very nice interpretation of the different variants of populism in the European context. To be very brief, since it's only 20 minutes that I'm supposed to speak at the maximum, I would like to say, give a very brief overview about the argument. In the traditional comparative political economy approach is to distinguish at least the Scandinavian, liberal Anglo-Saxon, and usually a continental model, sometimes adding to this is typically Southern European model. I'm very much inspired by this kind of literature, which people like Torben Iversen and Peter Hall and David Soskis have been proposing since several decades now. So it's a kind of varieties of capitalism approach, but also kind of varieties of different welfare states regimes approach. And I think with respect to our topic and this kind of theory about different kinds of globalization shocks, it makes sense to lump the continental and the Northern European model together, the Scandinavian one, into one category, since they are really open economies. They are very much dependent on export-led growth, and they all share universalist and generous welfare states. And from that, they become vulnerable to a certain kind of globalization, not to trade and capital globalization, because that's the very essence of the growth model, but to migration, to the movement of cross-border movement of people. The Southern model is very different, since it's not export-led growth, it's domestic demand-driven, and it has a very generous but a very particularistic welfare state, especially not really developed minimum income protection schemes, and those are those which make a welfare state vulnerable to migration. And so, if we look at the Western scene, I think see kind of globalization shock was mainly the currency and monetary policy and euro shock after 2008, 2009, when the global financial crisis transformed itself into the euro crisis. And that was really something about states and also private households being able to incur debt and to fuel that domestic demand-driven model of growth, yes or no. And then one would expect populist protest to articulate itself on the left. The Anglo-Saxon model, again, is one, of course, open, of course, highly compatible with a liberalized global economic order. Here, migration. So these are all ideal types, I would like to say. So one should always bear in mind that one cannot so neatly differentiate between these different vulnerabilities, but I talk about tendencies. So the tendency would here be it's less the welfare state which becomes problematic with respect to the movement of persons. It's rather the labor market, a very liberalized labor market with high employment in the low productivity service sector becomes then more vulnerable to unrestrained labor migration, and that becomes politically contentious. And that was both under Trump's US and also under in Brexit UK were the problems around 2015, 2016, 17. Fourth, we have an Eastern European model. And here I would say it rather resembles the Southern model in the sense that migration is not really problematic. That's mainly due to not accessible and not very generous and mature welfare states. So if something is here problematic, it should be rather trade or capital flows. Then people would immediately say, well, but as you know, if you look at Fidesz in Hungary and look at Kaczynski's in the PiS party in Poland, we of course see right-wing populism. And my answer would be here to say, yes, that's true, but that has something to do with the fact, which I don't know how many people are aware of it, but that the policy space in Eastern Europe is flipped in the sense that here culturally conservative parties offer on the economic dimension kind of left-wing policies. So if you seek protection from a Europeanized market, either agricultural market or a market of manufacturing goods, you would not vote for the Polish Citizens Platform because they are, in economic terms, they are neoliberal, but you rather would tend to seek protection from markets by voting right, because those parties are those offering protection from markets. So that leads then to this kind of fourfold typology. I don't want to go in any more detail since I think I said the basic things. So we have here variation between right-wing populism, either articulated by labor market insiders, as in the northern model, or by labor market outsiders, as in the liberal Anglo-Saxon model. We have insiders and those hoping to become insiders, protecting the high employment protection model and the demand-driven growth model in Southern Europe. And then we would have losers of globalization and transformation in the Eastern European countries, voting right, but choosing then left economic policies. So it should come to an end. And so I will abbreviate this a little bit and give a short outlook and then end. And then I'm very much looking forward to the debate and the discussion and the comments. maybe two outlooks. Where are we now with respect to that picture that I drew? So it is a little bit backward looking, and we can ask, so which kind of forward looking can we do now? In a sense, as long as the ECB with their zero interest policy is able to shield the domestic demand driven model in Southern Europe from stress, from globalization stress, so to speak, we should further expect that left-wing populism becomes less prominent in these cases. And in a certain respect, if secondary migration from the south to north is restricted, then of course we can also expect more right-wing populist protests to occur in these countries, like Vox and Lega is showing. If really inflation is bouncing back, and if the ECB cannot anymore follow its zero interest rate policy, my model would predict a resurgence of left-wing populism in the south. Very briefly, last point, what about the pandemic? Does the corona map onto left and right? As far as I see, not yet in any case. So the real dynamics here are mainly not on left and right, but rather government versus opposition, with the government really gaining in the first year of the pandemic very strongly, the government parties, a lot of increase of the support, and populism not really profiting from all the stress, the economic, the social, and so on. That might change over time. So these are the 11 European countries, the main European countries, also Hungary and Poland, here mapped with approval rate data, so to speak, or opinion poll data, vote shares. Yeah, and at the moment, we don't see a resurgence or a spillover of all the pandemic stress into a resurgence of populism, but that's a kind of spotlight at the moment that might change. So yeah, thanks a lot for your attention. I'm very much looking forward to hear from Sherry and Dan, and then from the general audience. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Philip. That was a fantastic overview, and some intriguing thoughts there on the end about how populism might sort of evolve in future. So Danny, I'm dying to hear what you make of it. Philip mentioned your 2018 paper that influenced and inspired him. That paper, as he mentioned, wasn't exclusively about Europe, and Latin America comes up in it and so on. So I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts in general, but in particular, I'm just curious about whether the sort of analysis that Philip has come up with is sort of what you would have expected, or has he taken it in a different direction than you might have thought when you wrote that 2018 paper?
Thank you, Hans, for having me in this discussion. It's a privilege to discuss this paper by Philip. I'm really very intrigued by this analysis, and I think the paper really is short, but is very rich in insights, and I think it's also crying out to be further developed and further analyzed using data and trying to fill out some of these boxes with the evidence. But I think it's very thought-provoking, and I think the key thing here is, as Philip said, it's really rather remarkable how little thought has gone to trying to explain why in some settings we've had a kind of a right-wing populism, in other settings we've had left-wing populism. I think most evidence shows that the primary beneficiaries, if you aggregate all the evidence across countries and look at vote shares and so forth, that the early beneficiaries on the political spectrum were more biased on the right-wing side. That is, that the right-wing parties were the one. You could sort of see this a little bit in the first chart, I think that Philip presented, that in the Northern European countries where, the big switch to the right. So in some sense, the big puzzle, which I'll come back to in a second, is to why, if the shocks are, as Philip and I in my own work have focused, that drive the resurgence of populism, mostly of an economic nature. And I'll say more a little bit about sort of broadening that concept of the, beyond hyperglobalization. Why is it that the right wing is actually the one who's able to capitalize so much on that? Because normally we would think, if the shocks are, of an economic nature and are driving societies apart in terms of incomes and opportunity and so forth, that left-wing parties might be better positioned to provide solutions. And yet the response has been much more potent on the right-wing side, sort of leveraging cultural and values and other kinds of sort of other dimensions of politics rather than economic policies. So when I think about this period, and I guess especially since I'm an economist, I have to think in terms of demand and supply. Philip briefly mentioned the supply side of politics, but this paper really is about the demand side. And I think the demand side is very important, and I'm completely in agreement with him that really, if we want to explain the rise in populism, so that's a question about the delta, not about the existence of populism, which has always been sort of, why did the National Front in France exist in the first place, right? If we're trying to explain the rise in vote shares and increase in popularity of right-wing populism, that I think economic explanation, the economic shocks, do a pretty good job of doing that. And so the exacerbation of prevailing economic cleavages through a range of economic shocks, I think creates a demand for a different kind of politics. But at the same time, I think that demand does not express itself in a particularly well-formed fashion. So it's a demand for outsiders, for different types of views, but it doesn't come fully formed in a programmatic fashion. So I think it's left-wing or right-wing coloring is really one that is provided by parties, by leaders, by programs, by who joins politics. So it's really determined, I think, to a large extent on the supply side of politics. And I think we need to bring in the supply side to understand why this early response took the right-wing form. My sort of very superficial explanation for this is that when these shocks hit, maybe I should back up for a second and talk a little bit about these economic shocks. Philip focuses on hyperglobalization, whether it's trade or immigration. But I think we need to think about these economic shocks in a somewhat broader way. They certainly include deinstitutionalization of labor markets. So deregulation of labor markets is in part, I think, an important phenomenon. For example, is a nice paper on Sweden by Torsten Persson and colleagues that looks at not trade shocks per se, but the sort of labor market deinstitutionalization, deregulation that accentuates the difference between insiders and outsiders, and that the support for Sweden Democrats comes from people who are sort of mostly on the outsiders, from who are the losers from this deinstitutionalization of labor markets, economic deregulation of labor markets. There's also, of course, in Europe, very importantly, the whole fiscal austerity experience after the financial crisis. So I would think about sort of these economic shocks in a broader canvas, and not just globalization or trade shocks or immigration shocks, but also deregulation of labor markets and the fiscal austerity shocks, which accentuated the economic and social cleavages within countries. Now, I think that the reason why the response immediately sort of benefited more right-wing populists was that, to some extent, I think the politicians on the left of the center were disadvantaged by the fact that in many of the leading countries we're talking about, they had been the ones who had been leading these so-called neoliberal economic policies in the first place. Of course, in the United States, it was the Clinton Democrats who championed NAFTA and hyperglobalization in the US. In Britain, it was New Labour and Tony Blair. In Germany, it was Schroeder. The social, so these were, the social democratic and left of center parties were caught ideologically, unable to respond and provide economic responses early on to these. And I think in some ways that has been changing. I mean, if you look at how the Democratic Party has moved from its economic policies in the last, just over the last 6-7 years, it's really quite amazing. So maybe I think there is a correction that's coming with the left of center sort of adjusting, but I think in part, it's the inability of the parties of the left to respond that left the field open for the center right, and in turn the center right moved further right. Now you can see actually how parties of the right took advantage of this. So we recently looked at some political advertising in the United States in response to, for example, the China trade shock. So if you look at the China trade shock as the archetypal economic shock, which we now have evidence not just from the United States, but Europe, in fact, even in Germany, that if you add up in Germany, the China trade shock with the trade shock of the integration of Eastern Europe into the EU, that there is a causal evidence that these trade shocks actually drove far-right populism. In the US, we see how the right responds to where these China trade shock happens. They respond by increasing their messaging, their political advertising on cultural issues, on things like abortion or gay rights or family values. This is actually measurable, that they actually responded by turning these grievances that are fundamentally, I think, economic in nature, in a sort of in a very different direction. That's, I think, the part of the story that I would like to see a little bit more of, although it takes away from the neatness of the structural explanation on the demand side. I should add that taking into account the features of the welfare state, as Philip does, is a very important contribution as well in understanding the response. But I'm cautious. I'm curious as to what Philip would say on sort of how important the supply side might be as well. Part of my emphasis on the supply side, of course, is I teach in a policy school. So I'm torn between social science and policy analysis. So social science, you want to explain everything structurally. There are these deep, structural forces that's driving outcomes. But of course, the more you believe in that, the less room you have for sort of telling, policymakers that there are things you can do, because everything is determined structurally. You have no room for actually changing. Whereas I do think that, at least in the case that I know best in the United States, there's a lot that the Democratic Party can do by taking on one program as opposed to another. And it was not a foregone conclusion that, let's say, Sanders could not have won the 2016 election, or Sanders might not have been the presidential candidate in the 2021, and so forth. The final, really more of a question I want to raise is with respect to Eastern Europe. One doubt that I had once we take the analysis of populism outside the context of established democracies in the United States and Western Europe, and start talking about Hungary, Poland, Brazil, Philippines, Turkey, Russia, sort of, and now we lump all of these things under this. I worry that we might be mixing two very different things, that what we experience or what we call populism in countries like Hungary or Poland or Turkey or Brazil or Philippines might be no different than simply a reversion to good old authoritarian politics in countries that actually have no well-established entrenched democratic tradition. And that, what looks like populism is just a different kind of authoritarianism, using the contemporary tools of politics, of social media, and some of the languages that's borrowed from the West and so forth. But that it's really fundamentally just a reversion to authoritarian politics. It's not populism as in Western Europe or in the United States. But that's just a hypothesis, and it's just a question that whether we might be making a category mistake when we extend the analysis to countries that are not well-established democracies. But once again, thanks, Philip, for a very insightful and very stimulating paper, and I hope everybody gets to read it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Danny. There was a lot there, and I want to give Philip a chance to respond, but I think maybe we'll take Sherry's response first and then come back to you, Philip, if that's all right. And I feel like in a way, Danny has kind of set you up perfectly, Sherry, because I mentioned at the beginning that there was this debate, it's very much sort of cultural causes versus economic causes of populism. And sometimes it did seem as if that debate was, basically economists arguing that it was economic causes and political scientists arguing that it was cultural causes. It's got, I think, a little bit more complicated since then. But what I thought was quite interesting was that Danny was bringing in, these questions around political entrepreneurs and so on that I thought you might bring in. So hope there's something left for you to say, but go ahead, Sherry.
Yes, thank you very much. And actually, Danny's comments were a great segue, because I think, sort of one of the things that struck me most when reading the paper, right, which is, so the emphasis here is on country level variation and how the nature of each country's economy, its economic profile, its welfare state sort of influences the nature and development of populism. And I think that, that is sort of very helpful, and digging down to the country level is certainly needed in this literature. But, sort of the problem is, Danny put it as a demand versus supply side kind of issue, right? Which is that the focus in Philip's paper is very much on the demand side, the things that might make citizens, so to speak, demand a particular type of politics, right? But if you stop there, the assumption is that those demands are directly translated into political outcomes, right? To use the old Marxist terminology, right? And this is a Marxist type of analysis in the sense that your position in the, means of production determines your political preferences, right? That's just not, it's not true, right? Wasn't true when Marxists asserted it. It's not true overall, right? Which is to say that those preferences are filtered through a whole variety of political variables, one of the most important of which, as Danny said, are political parties. That is to say, the choices, the options, the political preference structures that parties offer to voters. So I want to get back to that, but I also want to press a little bit on the beginning of the paper, right, which is the main country level variation that this paper focuses on is left versus right-wing populism. I'm just not sure that that's really all that relevant today, right? The left-wing populist parties that we had in Europe, right, were primarily, okay, so we had them in Greece, we had them in Spain, we have left and right-wing populism in France, because France is always a little crazy, right? But those left-wing populist parties in Greece and Spain, first of all, they're much less of a factor today than they were 10 years ago. Second of all, I would say that that distinction is really much better explained by political history. That is to say, the carryover of being, right-wing dictatorships for parts of the post-war period, and the sort of, the insulation that initially gave against the attraction of the radical right. That attraction has dissipated over time. And so the fact that we now, for instance, have a right-wing populist party in Spain strikes me as not entirely explained by that. But, that factor strikes me as much more relevant in explaining that north-south divide than other things. But let's go back to the real puzzle. And the real puzzle really is right-wing populism, because today, That's really the issue in Europe, right? And one thing to note from the supply side, right, is that that profile that you suggested that East European populist parties have, and we can debate what Danny says about whether those should be called right-wing populists. I think that's reasonable, but they all successful right-wing populist parties, regardless of the country, regardless of the type of economy it has, have exactly the same profile. That is to say, they are conservative, right-wing on non-economic, social, and cultural issues. And over time, despite the nature of the economies that we have, they have shifted to the center or even to the left on economic issues, right? They now, all the successful ones have the same profile. It doesn't matter if it's Italy, doesn't matter if it's Sweden, it doesn't matter if it's Austria. They all have the same profile, which is they press on things like immigration, national identity, and national sovereignty, where they are conservative. And they have moved to the center or even to the left on economic issues. Now, why have they done that? Well, the main reason is because the left parties in these countries opened up a space for them to do that, right? In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, social democratic labor parties moved to the center on economics, right? As was already mentioned, they often became actually the avatars of kind of neoliberalism. And they also moved to the left on social and cultural issues. And what did this do? This left a whole range of voters with relatively left views on economics, but right-wing views on social and cultural issues adrift. These are the people who now vote for right-wing populist parties. It's true in Italy, it's true in Sweden, it's true in Austria, it's true in France. Doesn't matter. They're always the same types of voters. Now, that's not the only voters who vote for these parties, but these are now the sort of modal voter for these parties, right? Low educated, low income voters who have, again, right-wing preferences on non-economic issues. Immigration is the most salient one in Europe, right? But national identity, national sovereignty, but who have relatively left-wing preferences on economic issues. And all of these parties have therefore moved to adopt this same kind of general profile because that's where the voters were. And the reason the voters were there, right, was not because their preferences had changed over time, not, I think, even because of economic shocks, but simply because in a previous era, they would have been captured by other parties, but no longer were. So really, to my mind, the puzzle is a little bit the opposite almost of what Philip says, which is these right-wing populist parties have all moved to the same political profile or the same policy profile, regardless of whether they're in Italy or Sweden, which are such dramatically different countries historically and economically. And yet the profiles of these parties have moved to become more or less the same. And I would suggest that the main reasons for that, again, I'm the political scientist on the panel, so you find what you're looking for, right? Have to do with politics, have to do with the supply side of the equation. That is to say, how parties have shifted over time. I'm not suggesting that's the only variable, but I would suggest that that's really the one that explains, to my mind, what the puzzle is, which is to say why right-wing populism has been so powerful in Northern Europe, in Central Europe, and in Eastern Europe. Now, in Eastern Europe, actually, this is even clearer, right? Because what happens after the transition from communism, in most East European countries, the parties that were in power were parties that were ostensibly parties of the left. But these parties were more right-wing on economic issues than the parties ostensibly on the right. These were the parties, sort of social democratic parties, quote unquote, left-wing parties, that were the ones that oversaw the sort of quote unquote neoliberal transition to capitalism in Eastern Europe. And over time, as the fallout from these transitions became clearer and clearer, and particularly after the financial crisis, what happens? People get fed up. And rather than voting for the left, which is associated with all of the pain of the transition, they now begin to vote for these right-wing populist parties that say to them, you know what, let's have a welfare state, right? We're going to give you a bunch of goodies, and we're going to tell you that the real problem here is, you know, again, all of these sort of left-wing lunatics on, you know, cultural and social issues, right? So you can watch the voters in Eastern Europe move much more easily than you can see in Western Europe, because the transition is much more direct and happens over a much shorter term, right? Low income, low educated voters in Eastern Europe shift from voting for parties of the left, and I put left in quotation marks because they were never left on economic issues at all, and they shift to these, you know, sort of whatever you want to call them, right-wing populist parties, you know, the peace and justice, you know, Orban, yada, yada, yada. You watch them do that. It's very clear what's going on there, right? And that is exactly the profile in Eastern Europe. Now, it's much more pronounced in Eastern Europe because of the historical reasons that you say and that Danny stressed. These are much less institutionalized democracies. So for that reason and for historical reasons, they are much clearer, so to speak, in their right-wing profile on things like immigration, of which there is none, or not, that's not true. That's not true. Which is much less direct in Eastern Europe. Really, the problem in Eastern Europe is the out migration, which makes them extremely sensitive to identity issues, right? But these are very clearly, their profiles on these issues are very clearly right-wing, but these are not right-wing parties on economic issues. They're just not, because that's not where the political space was. So let me say that I found this paper very, very helpful. You know, and I like the idea of thinking more about country level variations. And I like the idea of taking this, you know, sort of attempt, as Philip does and as other folks have done with varieties of capitalism, of thinking about how the specific structure of economies and welfare states matter, right? But again, I have a problem, perhaps again, as a political scientist, that this Marxist idea that there's this direct translation or even a relatively straightforward one, I think that just doesn't make sense. You don't have to be in a policy school to realize that, right? Which is to say that, you know, choices matter, right? What voters are presented with matter. And again, the other way you can see this, and I'll stop here because we want to have time for questions, is voters' preferences on these issues that are now so salient, immigration, national identity, voters' preferences have not become more conservative over time, right? They have not. Absolutely the opposite, right? The fact that these things have become so much a part of our political conversation and our political structure has nothing to do with the underlying preference structure, in the sense that there's no direct translation between conservative views on these issues and the popularity of the parties that stress them. The reason these things have become so much more salient has to do with what parties have offered voters. It has less to do with people's underlying preferences, because again, supply matters. The choices that are offered to voters matter. Anyway, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to think about these issues.
Brilliant, thank you, Sherry. So Philip, do you want to respond to some of that before we take some questions? There's a lot there. I guess the overall sort of main point is around, you know, I guess basically this question is too mechanistic, and are we neglecting this kind of supply demand direction? And then I will throw in one question from the audience, because it goes to one specific thing that Sherry and Danny actually both mentioned, which is around Central and Eastern Europe, and this sort of question around, you know, are these right-wing parties in Central and Eastern Europe actually an outlier in somehow the way you're suggesting, or actually are they sort of almost paradigmatic, as I think Sherry is kind of suggesting, sort of intensified version of what's happened, or a sort of accelerated version of what's happened elsewhere, and in particular this sort of idea that you know, this combination of sort of left-wing economic policies and right-wing cultural policies is nothing sort of unusual. This is actually what far-right parties everywhere are like and have always been like. And I can't help but think of sort of, you know, National Socialism, which in a way is the same sort of, you know, the same kind of combination. They created a kind of a welfare state, albeit for, you know, non-Jewish Germans. But in a way, is this perhaps the norm rather than a sort of an outlier? And yes. Sorry, I said I was going to throw in a question from the audience, which was related to that, and then forgot to do that. But that was basically this question around, you know, is, you know, the left wing, right wing sort of dichotomy part of the problem here? That we, you know, that isn't really very helpful in this context. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's very demanding and challenging, and I'm probably not able to take up all the points which have been raised. Yeah, but very helpful. And so one point is really the supply versus demand stuff, which both Danny and Sherry stressed, and I don't want to come across too deterministic. Yes, my way of thinking is something starting with political economies, so with kind of regimes, welfare state regimes, labor market regimes, growth models. So that sounds a little bit structuralist. I don't want to claim that this is the whole story, but I think there is this kind of systematic variation which is worth stressing and emphasizing, as so much of the previous discussion, as Hans emphasized, was really on cultural terms. So people with bad preferences, and what do you do about that? And also the kind of inability to come to terms with the very striking variation, and then of course, which has also a temporal variation. Yes, a left-wing populism was much more prevalent, much more prominent in the immediate reaction to the financial crisis and so on, especially in Europe. But still, one can say, okay, that's over, but I think we still need to address we need to explain that, and so the 1 point supply side. Yes, we have political entrepreneurs. They in a way, if you influence public debate, you need a kind of culturalization of things. You cannot argue with OECD statistics. You need a kind of, there must be plausible narratives. So if an Italian politician tries to exploit a plausible narrative in Italy is there is a elite which has forgotten the people. So that in Italy, without any, hopefully without any kind of prejudice, I would say that would be a narrative which resonates in an Italian case. If you're a Swedish politician and say, okay, we have here a corrupt La Casta, which really is full of contempt for the usual people and is completely corrupt, that's much less of a plausible narrative in a Swedish context. So what do I want to say with that? If we think about political, if we also think about economic regimes, then it can be a plausible narrative to say, okay, now all these migrants come to your country and they benefit from generous welfare entitlements. This is a plausible narrative in certain contexts, but not in others. So I think there is a matching or a kind of correspondence, and it's not completely loose and it's not completely voluntaristic or constructivistic, between certain growth models, political economies, labor markets, welfare state regimes, and certain political discourses which you can pursue and others not. So, for instance, I found this very striking. This public survey result from Sweden. If you ask Swedish workers, is this migrant taking away your employment? Will you become unemployed because you have so much migration? Then you will, under Sweden Democrats voters, you will get something, a response rate like 10–15%. So that's not the worry. They know that the migrant will not, he or she hasn't the skill, the language skill, the education, and so. So there is no fear of being replaced by a migrant. Not for the core segments of the Swedish worker class. But you have an 80% response rate saying, okay, too much migration will overstrain the public resources of the Swedish welfare state. So what I want to say is so it's not completely, politicians, so I think you're completely right in stressing there is, of course, an activist, voluntaristic, entrepreneurial side of all that. There's a supply side, absolutely. And we can talk about general dimensions of political communications under new social media conditions, but we can speak about certain conditions, narratives which resonate in one context and not in others. So that would be my general response. So I still think it's not too deterministic to start from basic redistributional regimes and who is benefiting, who is suffering, who is cushioned from globalization shock and who is not cushioned. So one could go, Eastern Europe, one could say it's the avant-garde. So they started with this new combination of being cultural conservative and being economically left, and then the others learned. Yeah, parties like the Danish Folkeparti or the early National Front, which now became Rassemblement National, they started, of course, with a kind of petite bourgeoisie, anti-tax, anti-state, anti-etatist, and they moved to the left. Yes, absolutely. But that also meant that their, how do you say, their core voter clientele moved from being petite bourgeoisie to working class, so to speak. I'm not so sure whether this is only because the working class has been abandoned in cultural terms or even in a kind of new labor approach, because if you look to Spain, to Italy, to Greece, and so on, there was not really such a new labor movement. There were no. And if you look at the early responses in these countries, of course they were left, so they were not disappointed by the left. And if you look at the very early responses, like Berlusconi, so there was a right-wing populist party, a very early one in Italy, if you say so, Forza Italia, Berlusconi, but it never was anti-immigration. And it was economically, of course, it was always more public debt, more public spending, and so on. So I still think that it makes sense to really start with welfare state regimes or growth models or varieties of capitals. The same applies a little bit to Eastern Europe. Just compare the Romanian socialist with the Hungarian Fidesz and with the Polish PiS party. You won't find many differences. One is labeled as left, Romanian socialists, the others are labeled as right-wing. But if you look at their economic and cultural policies and their kind of anti-Euro skepticism and their homophobia and so on, they're pretty much the same. So I'm not so sure. Well, I would say, okay, the variants of left and right are more interesting than the global categories left and right, really depending on the growth models you have here. So maybe I should stop, because now, if I correctly, we have only 25 minutes left. Yeah, and then we maybe open it to the general discussion. Let me say one more word to Danny. Yes, I think he's absolutely correct in saying that the scope conditions of the argument should be more clear. And if I say it's the political economy of populism in Europe, I should stick to the European examples. Brazil or Philippines or so are really not, neither is my field of specialty, nor can claim any kind of expertise. And there's, I think, a very valid point saying, okay, what we here call populism might be simply authoritarianism. I would accept the Eastern European countries from that. And speaking of a consolidated democracy, 1 year ago, from the storm on the Capitol in the US, and speaking of non-consolidated democracy in Eastern Europe, I think we have to be a little bit more cautious in that respect. So.
Danny or Sherry, do you want to add anything more at this point, or should I take some questions first? Or do you have anything burning you want to say right now?
Oh, take questions, I think. Okay,
great. So we've got 34 questions. So what I'm going to do is sort of try and group a few of them together into little clusters, and then you can pick and choose which of these you want to answer. So, so Philip at the end of his talk mentioned the pandemic. But there's, I think, an intriguing question about the climate crisis and how that might play into some of these political dynamics. So in particular, the question is, you know, do you see any prospect for a kind of green populism? I would throw in, you know, is there also a possibility of a sort of anti-green populism? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Then secondly, there are a few questions that touch on the EU, and I feel like we probably should talk about the EU because we haven't mentioned it so far, but it does come into Philip's argument. The question from one of our viewers is, what about the fact that the populists are taking advantage of the real tension between the globalist federalist agenda for a federalist EU and the people fighting for their national identity and sovereignty? And then I wonder if there's a few questions that touch on the United States and Trump. And I was struck by the way that, Philip, you said, Trump without Twitter is sort of inconceivable, which also brings in the social media question. What role does social media play in this? There's a lot, I think, of sort of slightly inflated claims about the role that social media plays in populism. In fact, actually, it seems to me if you take Trump, that the cable news networks played a much bigger role in his rise and in his success actually than Twitter did. But I'd love to hear, and maybe this is for Sherry and or Danny, I'd love to hear your thoughts on sort of similarities and differences between populism in the United States and in Europe. Are they the same, basically, as a lot of people I think seem to assume, or are there some important differences as I would argue, I think? But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So maybe, Sherry, should we start with you on any of those 4 issues? So in other words, the environment, the EU, US, Europe, and social media.
So those are a lot of issues.
You don't have to do them all, just pick whichever ones you.
So let me just say on the EU, I mean, look, as insofar as populism, and this is actually true of most of the populist parties, regardless of whether you want to consider them left or right wing, which is they have this kind of, in a way, I don't know what you would call it, national sovereigntist bias. That is to say that the EU is seen as kind of intervening in illegitimate ways, whether it's because they're, sort of faceless, undemocratic bureaucrats, or because it represents the avatar of neoliberalism, and so I think that, that it's very difficult to understand populism in Europe. This is obviously not true of the United States or Latin America without thinking about the role played by the EU in, in a variety of issues. So, I mean, obviously, I think that should come in. As far as, the United States goes, look, the United States, I think this is an important point that Philip's paper makes, right, which is that, we do have to start with the peculiarities of each country. The United States has a history of sort of racial division that is not replicated, obviously. In Europe, we also have a 2-party system as opposed to a multi-party system. So basically what we had was a sort of right-wing populist takeover of one of our political parties, right? There was always that right-wing populist faction within the Republican Party. I would say what you could interpret what's happened in the United States is the power of that party grew over time. And with the election of Trump, a sort of cascade effect happened so that now the party is, sort of securely in that camp, with the other factions of the Republican Party now being pushed to the margins or even outside of the party. But, there are some obvious similarities. I mean, the Republican Party's economic policy remains more or less resolutely conservative, but yet the rhetoric has changed. And I think the distraction effect of right-wing populism is even more pronounced. I mean, what do right-wing politicians in the United States do? Republican politicians, Fox News, Republican, avatars on, Twitter and otherwise, which is they constantly press on these non-economic issues, right? They don't talk about their economic policy. Why? Because it's incredibly unpopular, even among their own voters. And they know that any emphasis on what Republicans actually do as far as economic policy is concerned is not going to help them at all. So they distract by stressing cultural and social issues on which their base is strongly united and which the Democratic Party has moved even further to the left on. Those are the winning issues for them. And so in that sense, I think there's an important, sort of cross-national similarity, right? Which is that the more these issues are at the forefront of the political agenda, the better it is for right-wing populist parties.
And maybe just as a follow-up on that, to what extent do you think Trump, as it does actually represent a break with, the history of the Republican Party up to that point? So one of the questions here is, to what extent is this essentially a continuation of the culture war that began with Nixon's Southern strategy and continued with Reagan and Bush and so on? Are we perhaps exaggerating the break that Trump represents?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't put it as a break. And the sort of, the overly simplistic trajectory that I laid out 2 minutes ago suggests that, this was one faction within the Republican Party. I think it grew over time, but you still had different factions within the party. I think what Trump represented was not something new, right? But the period or the opportunity when that faction clearly just kind of took over the party and at this point has basically pushed any other significant voices to the margins or even outside. I mean, a world where Liz Cheney is now considered to be beyond the pale. My God, is she conservative? Really shows you what has happened. But again, this was not a creation of Trump. He was kind of, again, the sort of, the point of no return, at least for the short to medium term.
Great. Danny.
Yeah, on the EU, I remember being at a meeting where I was talking about sort of this idea of the trilemma or the incompatibility among democracy, national sovereignty, and hyperglobalization, that you cannot have all three of those at the same time. And in some sense, the structural problem of the EU is that it pretends to have all those three. And I remember a former finance minister of the Euro area said at the time that the reason that populists are winning is that they are the only groups that are actually telling the truth about the trilemma. That is, that they're actually willing to say this out loud. Now, the direction in which they're taking it is very different direction than obviously I would want to see it. But that's the problem. I mean, I think that the center, whether it's the center right or the center left in Europe, has not owned up about these trade-offs, and I think it sort of has left it weak and unable to address this question of, yes, there is a tension between greater accountability of the politicians that we elect on the one hand, and all this sort of Europe-wide integration of financial markets, the single market, and the hundreds of thousands of pages of the acquis communautaire and all those regulations out of Brussels. And as long as the political forces at the center don't explicitly acknowledge that and explicitly make their choice, saying that, yes, we are pushing forward into deeper integration within Europe, because we think it's to the advantage of most people. And if we acknowledge that that's going to actually reduce the responsiveness of locally elected or nationally elected politicians. And this is how we plan to make up for that loss of policy space domestically, how we expand political space in other dimensions. But that there has to be acknowledgement and an idea that that's what we're doing. And I think that's what has been lacking from the political center in Europe in acknowledging this.
Yeah.
Like Sherry in
sorry,
Europe.
Danny, before you move on to that next question, sorry to interrupt, but can I just push you on that? Would it be fair to say that you're in your sort of concept of hyperglobalization, that in a sense the EU has sort of been in a quite extreme form of that? It's gone even further than the rest of the world has in the last 30, 40 years in terms of removing barriers to capital and goods and people. So there's a kind of, I don't think you use this term, but I remember reading this and thinking that there's something like hyper-Europeanization, which is a sort of even more extreme form of hyperglobalization, but in a regional context.
Absolutely. I mean, hyperglobalization is an ideal form for the world, but it's a reality and very much within Europe. I mean, I think the European Union, particularly the Euro area, is as close to hyperglobalization as a regional form of hyperglobalization. It's the most extreme form that we have.
Yeah. Thank you.
But I don't want to take more time.
No, please.
From Philip on. Maybe we can come back. So let me just stop here.
Well, did you want to say anything about I don't know, perhaps the green issue, because this also, I think, relates to this possible shift in the economic paradigm that may or may not be now happening.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, and here is the sense in which I think US and Europe are sort of similar. Again, my diagnosis is that the fundamental problem, both in Western Europe and the United States, is a labor market problem, is what labor economists call labor market polarization. That jobs of middle skill, middle qualification have been disappearing. There's been much greater economic precarity in the lower and middle classes. So it's not really a problem about the very bottom of the poorest or the lowest paid workers, but it's really sort of the ongoing effects of deindustrialization, loss of manufacturing workers that clearly has been accentuated by hyperglobalization, but also sort of automation and the new technologies that have resulted in loss of sales and clerical kind of jobs. And this labor market polarization also has taken a very kind of a geographical dimension. So you can see it very clearly in regions that are being left behind. So this is, I think, is as much a problem in France as it is in the United States, for example, even though in France, you don't see, if you look at the Gini coefficient, or if you look at indicators of inequality, you don't see anything like the kind of rise in inequality that you've seen in the United States. But this fundamental labor problem is as much a feature of underlying French political economy as it is, I think, in the United States. So against that context, what we need to do, I think, is and here's where I think the welfare state, our traditional welfare state response, is so inadequate, because the way that the welfare state responds typically is either by investing in more education or by ex post transfers or redistribution and social insurance. But if what's happening is the disappearance of good jobs for the middle class and pathways to the middle class, then simply preparing people for jobs that don't exist or simply exposed redistribution doesn't solve this problem. So what you need are much more directly productivist policies that directly intervene in goods markets, in the direction of technological change, in labor markets. And that's where I think sort of the green transition also comes in, because in many ways, the green transition is both a threat to that, because it might exacerbate job losses in particular areas, but it's also an opportunity because it's a way of creating more jobs through investments in green technology. So I think the great political prize, at least on the left of the political spectrum, is for parties or leaders that can articulate a program that I think is going to be fundamentally going to be able to address this good jobs crisis, or sort of the supply of good jobs, and therefore shore up the middle class, while at the same time being able to undertake this green transition. And there's no reason they ought to be enemies of each other. But I think the range of interventions are quite structural, and I think they need to go beyond the kind of focus on industrial policy in the United States and in Europe to some extent today. That's really much more focusing on the China, on high technology. Europe is obsessed with the digital and green transformation, but doesn't talk actually about the role of jobs in industrial policies as much. So I think there is we need to wrap our heads around that when we think about these industrial and regional policies that need to be much more sort of good job centered.
That's really interesting. And it actually takes us slightly back to the question of Europe and the United States and some of the differences, because I remember it reminds me of how during some of those debates around TPP and TTIP and so on, around trade agreements, the US has trade adjustment assistance, which may not work very effectively, but at least the aspiration is to retrain people for productive jobs. Whereas often it seemed to me that the European response to that was just the welfare state is how we deal with this. In other words, you're just accepting that people are going to be on the dole rather than trying to find new jobs for them. Philip, lots there. As I say, pandemic, green populism, EU, US, Europe, social media. Take your pick.
Okay. So I would like to have a short sentence on, or a short comment on the European dimension, and then also on the climate change versus the pandemic. Starting with, so I think one could have written the paper more or less with the same content, but with the different framing and saying, okay, what are the distributional consequences of European integration given the different political economies within that economic sphere and political sphere, so to speak. So in a way, I think that talking about these two ways of shocks can be made much more concrete. So the globalization shock and this movement of capital and goods across borders and migration shock, movement of persons across borders, by really saying, okay, what we saw in 2010, we saw the first one, and in 2015 we saw the second one, and we simply can say that these different political economies in Europe were very much differently affected, so to speak. So it were the demand-driven models in the South which were affected by the first kind of shocks. It were the export-led growth models which were affected by the second shock. And so you could, I think, and that matches really nicely what Danny said about that this is a, how do you say, it's a very specific European integration story, and it's partly a story about over-integration, overstretch of integration, so it's Schengen and Euro, so that there is a loss of national sovereignty in both these dimensions, and the different political economies are very differently vulnerable to these two. That's basically, so you can make the same argument in that kind of language, so to speak. Now, I think the second point which Danny rose is interesting, as it really says, okay, we can talk about what is the relation between, so this is very much on globalization, but what now Danny rose is much more about technological change or technological progress. And one could say that, I think it's an open question how much this is both linked, but these are what would be different causal factors. So the one is really the transition to a knowledge economy, and that's basically technologically driven. And one could say, yes, globalization is a factor fueling that, but that's a different causal model. I think it's a different causal explanation. And of course, one could say, yes, we are obsessed with globalization shocks, but what is really going, so the big transformation is really the transition to a knowledge economy, and that means the loss of old manufacturing jobs, well-paid, highly productive, and the question whether this transition leads to enough sufficiently paid, decently paid, good, productive new jobs, and so on. So, and I think here comes the climate and the COVID pandemic stuff a little bit into play, because seen from that angle, one could say, yes, maybe populist parties are mainly mobilizing those people who fear, either who experience or who fear to lose out in this process of technological change. So this kind of medium-skilled, semi-skilled, but relatively well good paid jobs in manufacturing are gone, and increasingly are gone, and it's not, and then we get this income polarization between the, then you have this kind of low productivity, low wage service jobs which are created, so this kind of bad jobs, and then we have some, of course, a certain segment of the population profiting from this transition. So we have a new middle class, and then we have an old middle class suffer, and that's the new diamond. That's the new cleavage line, so to speak. That would be a slightly different explanation. And as far as I see, is the both pandemic story and the climate change story maps onto that new cleavage, in the sense that those losing out in this transition to the knowledge economy, or those fearing to lose out, are also those who have at least the perception that they cannot afford, so to speak, that it will be, that they will have a much higher consumption model, so to speak. They will have higher expenses. They cannot afford to leave their diesel in the garage and to change to an electric car. They cannot afford shutdowns. They have to work, and so on and so on. So I think here we see a new cleavage line between the old middle class and the new middle class, and the old middle class is very much opposed to climate change, because they think, or the adaptation of climate change, because they think it will make their living much more expensive. And then we have, of course, the political entrepreneurs and the cultural stuff coming in. So you're less allowed to drive fast and, I don't know, barbecue every second day. And so there comes this new cleavage line, and which then can be exploited by skillful political entrepreneurs. But I think that's much more plausible on these two dimensions. People having problems. So for them, lockdowns and COVID and Corona times are really have a very special bias. So they are, for those people like us working in front of screens, and then say, okay, and the food will be delivered to my home by these new lousy service sector job employees, so to speak. So there I can see a new field. In a way, I think the party politics literature shows. Of course, we have here suppliers and we have entrepreneurs, political entrepreneurs, and they are always looking for new topics and new themes and how to adjust in a volatile political market. And yes, these would be new ways of differentiating the portfolio one has, the populist portfolio, from anti-migration, anti-EU policies to, I don't know, to anti-corona and anti-climate change policies, so to speak. I see that in different shades in the different countries already.
Maybe one just very final quick question before we end. Because we haven't talked much about the interaction between populist parties and mainstream parties. Well, I guess we did in terms of the sort of the rise of populism, but it just strikes me that by focusing too much on sort of populist parties and figures and movements themselves and their kind of rise and fall, are we not neglecting a little bit that dynamic between populist parties and centrist parties? I'm old enough to remember British politics in the very late 70s when, you know, the National Front, I mean, the French National Front has been mentioned, but we had a National Front in Britain, and it pretty much disappeared after 1979 because Margaret Thatcher responded to the concerns of a lot of those voters around immigration in particular. And that was pretty much the end of the National Front. So as far as populist parties in Europe today, does a lot just not depend on how centre-right parties in particular respond to far-right parties? And could we not see a situation, in fact, I would argue this is partly what's happening already, that far-right parties lose support, but that's only really because centre-right parties are adopting a large part of their agenda. Sherry, maybe? I think you've written about this.
Indeed, with you, in fact. So look, I mean, I think that's a really important point, right? Which is, and to just sort of generalize from that, I would say that whenever you see the rise of new parties, and in the American case, for instance, we could think about the change within the party as sort of perhaps being the sort of analogous development. Whenever you see the rise of new parties in a party system, you know, those are by definition response to an opening in that party system. That is to say that there are some issues or some voters who are not being responded to. So from a basic perspective, yes, you know, that we have seen the growth of these, in particular, right-wing populist parties, by definition, reflects the fact that there are issues and voters who are not being captured by the mainstream parties. And so, you know, if we were to look back over the last decade and a half or longer, what we would see again, I mean, I talked a lot about the shift in parties of the center left, as did Danny Roderick, but parties of the center right are also obviously a very important part of this equation. And if you look at vote transfers over time, not just in one election, but over time, you can watch where voters are moving around. And surely, you know, you see a lot of voters moving from center right to far right parties in some elections and at some times. And that gives you some indication of sort of what kinds of issues and problems are absolutely pushing them. And I think the fact, as you said, that right-wing populist parties have become more prominent in a lot of party systems has led parties of the center right to think, okay, look, you know, we want to recapture as many of these voters as we can. And so that you've seen, for instance, in places like France and perhaps in Germany, you know, center-right parties sort of shifting, you know, a little bit to the right on these social and cultural issues strikes me as undeniably a response to, you know, the growing popularity of these right-wing populist parties. You know, whether they can recapture these voters or not will depend. In places like France, they're now fairly structurally ensconced in these parties, but you know, this is a long-term process. You never know.
Maybe maybe I can add one thought. So in a way, I would say, in Europe, you have this very ironic effect that even so, like the Rassemblement National or the UKIP party or the Brexit party, then later on, which had really problems of representation in the majoritarian electoral systems of France and Britain, then were very successful in European elections. So they were both the most successful British and French parties in the, I think, 2016 election in the EP, and even 5 years earlier. So, and then you have this very ironic and in a certain sense sad effect of a very generous base provided by them in Brussels, so that they then can re-campaign in the national context from that position. And that's really, so in a way you have there is then an entrenchment of these parties. I think if you look at the German way of financing parties, once they are there, and that really speaks directly to Sherry's comments, and I think also Danny's comments about, you know, how adjustable these parties are in seeking new topics and new themes. Once they are there, it's not so easy to get rid of them again, you know, given the very generous support they either get on the European level or in a party system like the German one. So that's the hope that one can say, whether it's a hope or rather a dystopian view, that there's somebody who is then you know, making them superfluous, might not be in place in this case. Yeah.
Danny, anything you want to add? Okay, it's been such a privilege to have you both, Danny and Sherry. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Philip, for the paper, for presenting it. Thank you to everybody who stayed with us for an hour and a half and for your questions. Sorry we couldn't answer all of them. Do read the paper. My colleague Rudy has posted a link to it in the chat. And we will hope to see you again at another Chatham House Europe Programme event soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.